Painting was the ugliest thing I had ever loved, and I kept it wrapped in an old cotton bedsheet in the trunk of my car for 3 days before the dinner, because I didn't trust anyone in that house not to touch it. It was just a barn, a lopsided red barn with a crooked weather vane and a sky that looked like someone had smeared it on with their thumb. My grandmother painted it the last winter she was alive in the sunroom of her house in Burlington, with the space heater rattling at her feet and her hands shaking so bad she had to brace her wrist against the easel. She was 81. She'd never painted a day in her life until she was 79, and then she did it like she was making up for lost time. I sat with her most of those afternoons. I was the only one who did. When she gave it to me, 6 weeks before she passed, she held my face in both her hands and said, "Promise me you won't let anybody tell you what it's worth." I thought she meant in the sentimental way. I said I promised. I didn't understand yet. I'm 31. My name doesn't matter much in this story. What matters is that I was the granddaughter who showed up, and that made me a problem. The dinner was my stepfather's idea. He called it a family reconciliation, which was rich, because the only thing my stepfather had ever reconciled was a checkbook, and not even well. My mother married him when I was 19, 2 years after my dad left, and from the very first Thanksgiving he treated me like a houseguest who'd overstayed. He had a way of saying my name that made it sound like a typo. He owned a car dealership out on Route 7, the kind with the giant inflatable tube man flailing by the road, and he wore his success like a cologne he'd bought too much of. My mother had asked me to bring something for the wall in their new sunroom. She knew about the painting. She knew what it meant. I should have known better than to walk it through that front door. There were maybe 40 people there. My stepfather's golf friends, his sales managers, a couple of cousins I barely recognized, all of them holding wine they didn't finish. He'd hired a caterer and a guy in a vest to pour drinks. It was the kind of party thrown not to celebrate anything, but to be seen celebrating. My mother floated around in the dress that still had the fold lines from the box. I'd leaned the painting against the wall by the fireplace, still half wrapped, because I wanted to give it to her quietly, away from the noise. That was my mistake. My stepfather found it first. I was getting a glass of water in the kitchen when I heard him laugh, that big performing laugh he used when he had an audience. By the time I came around the corner, he had the sheet pulled all the way off and the painting held up over his head like a trophy he was about to mock. "Would you look at this?" he said, loud enough that the room went quiet. My stepdaughter brought us art. People chuckled, the way people do when a rich man makes a joke and they aren't sure yet if it's safe to laugh. "What is this supposed to be? A barn? Did a kindergartner do this?" He tilted it side to side. "I've got a 6-car showroom with beautiful things and she brings me a barn," somebody finger-painted. "That's Grandma's," I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. "She made that. It's for Mom." He looked at me and I watched him decide to be cruel. He always decided it. It was never an accident with him. "Your grandmother," he said, "spent her whole life being broke and confused, and then she died and left a pile of junk for everybody to fight over. And this?" He shook it. "This is the masterpiece." There was a galvanized tub by the bar, the kind they fill with ice and beer bottles for parties. Before I understood what he was doing, he walked it over there and dropped the painting in, face down, into the slush and the cold water and the floating bottle caps. "Trash goes where trash belongs," he said, and brushed his hands together like he'd taken out the garbage. I want to tell you I screamed. I didn't. Something in me went very still and very cold, colder than that tub. I crossed the room and I lifted it out, water running off the back of the canvas in a sheet, and I held it against my chest, soaking through my blouse. And I looked at my mother. She was looking at the floor. That was the part that broke something. Not him. Her. I wrapped the painting back in a sheet, slow, careful, while 40 people watched and nobody said a word. Then I walked out the front door and I did not slam it. I set it gently in the back seat of my car like it was a person, and I drove the 4 hours home to Boston in the dark with the heater blasting, trying to dry it out, talking to it like an idiot the whole way. It's okay. We're okay. We're going home. I cried somewhere round Concord. Then I stopped, and I didn't cry again for a long time. Here's the thing nobody at that party knew, including me, not fully. My grandmother had a friend. His name was Augustus. Gus, she called him. And back in the 60s, before she married my grandfather and became a Vermont housewife, she'd lived in New York for 4 years and worked as a studio assistant. To a painter. A real one. A name that, if I said it, you would recognize because his work hangs in 2 museums I can name off the top of my head and sells at auction for more than most people make in a lifetime. She never talked about it. I knew she'd lived in the city once, the way you know your grandmother had a whole life before she was your grandmother. As a fact with no edges to it. I didn't know she'd been close to him. I didn't know she'd kept things. I found out 3 weeks after the dinner, when I finally worked up the nerve to take the painting to be cleaned. The water had seeped under the frame and I was terrified of mold. There's a conservation studio in the South End run by a woman who restores church murals and old portraits, and I brought it to her mostly to save my grandmother's barn, the thing I actually cared about. She put it on the table under a bright lamp and looked at the front for a while, polite, the way you'd look at a child's drawing someone handed you. Then she turned it over to check the stretcher bars for water damage, and she went quiet. "Who did this painting?" she asked. "My grandmother. It's not, I know it's not good. I just don't want it to rot." "No," she said, still looking at the back. "Not this one, the one underneath." I didn't understand. She showed me. On the back of the canvas, my grandmother had stretched her amateur barn over an older canvas, reused it, the way people did when materials were expensive. And bleeding through the back, where the conservator could see the weave, was another painting entirely. Older, the ground layer, the brushwork, a corner of a signature that had been painted over. She didn't say the name out loud. She said very carefully, "I think you should not let this leave the building today. I think you should sit down, and I think we should call somebody who knows more than I do." I sat down. It took 4 months and 3 experts and a lab in New York that does pigment analysis to say what the conservator suspected the first afternoon. Underneath my grandmother's barn was a small unfinished study by the painter she'd assisted 60 years ago. A study believed lost, mentioned in his letters, never recovered. She must have taken the canvas when she left the city. Maybe he gave it to her. Maybe she just kept it, the way you keep a thing from a life you're never going back to. And then, decades later, an old woman with shaking hands and a space heater had painted a barn right on top of it, never knowing. Or maybe knowing exactly what she was covering. Promise me you won't let anybody tell you what it's worth. The auction estimate came back at $1.4 million. The barn, her barn. The part she painted, which they were able to lift and preserve separately. The experts said that one was, in their words, of no market value whatsoever. I kept that one. I will keep it until I die. It hangs in my hallway where I see it every single morning. Now, here's where I have to tell you about the debt, because my stepfather, it turned out, was not as rich as the inflatable tube man wanted you to believe. The dealership had been bleeding for 2 years. He'd taken out a second mortgage on the house. My mother's house, technically, the one she'd brought into the marriage, and he was behind on it. He'd borrowed against inventory he didn't fully own. He was, in the most precise sense, drowning, and doing it loudly enough that nobody noticed. I learned all this because, around the same time the lab confirmed what I had, my mother called me, first time in 4 months. She didn't apologize for the dinner. She never once, in all of this, apologized for the dinner. What she said was, "Honey, we're in a little trouble and your grandmother left some things and we were thinking, since you got the cottage." The cottage. My grandmother's house in Burlington. She'd left it to me, free and clear, in a will so simple and so airtight that even my stepfather's lawyer couldn't find a loose thread. He'd been trying. I knew he'd been trying, because the lawyer had sent me 2 letters I didn't answer. "You want me to sell Grandma's house," I said, "so you can pay his debts." "It's not like that," she said, which is what people say when it's exactly like that. "He's family. We're family. She would have wanted us to help each other." I almost laughed. I held the phone away from my face and I looked at the barn on my wall, the ugly, beautiful barn, and I thought about a man dropping it into a tub of ice water in front of 40 people while my mother studied the floor. "Let me think about it," I said, and then I did something I'm not proud of and not ashamed of either. I made a plan. I didn't forge anything. I want to be clear about that because I've thought about it a lot since. The question of what I actually did. I didn't lie. I didn't fake a document. Everything I did was true and legal, and I have the paperwork to prove it. What I did was let people who had underestimated me keep right on underestimating me for exactly as long as I needed them to. I called my mother back and I told her yes. I told her I'd been thinking about family and Grandma and how she would have wanted us all together and that I'd be willing to help. But I wanted to do it properly, in front of everyone, so there'd be no confusion later about who gave what. I suggested we have another dinner, a real reconciliation this time. I said I'd even host, and pay for it, at a private room in a restaurant downtown. My stepfather got on the phone himself for that one. Suddenly, I was kiddo. Suddenly, my grandmother was a wonderful woman. He was so warm I could have fried an egg on him. I invited everyone who'd been at the first dinner. The golf friends, the sales managers, the cousins. I told my mother to make sure they all came, that I wanted witnesses to the family coming back together. She thought she understood what that meant. She didn't. The night of I wore a plain navy dress and I brought a leather folio. Inside it were 3 things. The auction house's signed letter of authentication and valuation, a copy of my grandmother's will, the clean and unbreakable one, and a printout of a public court filing, a foreclosure notice on my mother's house, filed 2 weeks earlier, with my stepfather's name on it, a matter of public record that anyone could have looked up, that I simply had. My stepfather stood up before dinner to make a toast. Of course he did. He raised his glass and he talked about family, about second chances, about how blood was thicker than water, and he looked at me when he said it, and he smiled, because he thought I was about to hand him a check. I stood up too. I said I had something to give the family, and that's true, I did. I opened the folio. I started with the painting. I told them what was under the barn. I passed the authentication letter down the table and watched it go hand to hand, watched their faces change, watched the number land. 1.4 million. The barn, somebody finger-painted. The trash that goes where trash belongs. Then, while the room was still humming, I set the foreclosure notice on the table in front of my mother. Gently. The way I'd set the painting in my car. I looked into helping, I said. I really did. But here's what I found. And I read it out. The second mortgage. The default. The fact that the house she kept asking me to save, she was about to lose anyway. Not to bad luck, but to the man sitting next to her who'd borrowed against it without telling her, and was now hoping a dead woman's house and a granddaughter's guilt would bail him out before anyone found out how deep it went. I watched my mother read it. I watched her understand it. I watched her look at her husband the way I'd needed her to look at him 4 months ago in front of a tub of ice. My stepfather said it was a misunderstanding. He said it loudly, then less loudly, then he stopped saying it, because the golf friends and the sales managers were already pushing back their chairs, already finding their coats, already deciding it was not safe to laugh. I didn't pay his debts. I want to be clear about that too. I didn't save him and I didn't save the house, because the house was his to lose, not mine to rescue. What I did do after that dinner was simpler and only for her. I sold the painting. It went to a private collector through the auction house, and after the fees and the taxes. And the taxes were real, the kind of money that makes you understand why people lie about being rich. There was enough. I bought my mother a small place near me in Massachusetts in her name only, with a clause her husband's lawyer would have wept to read. She doesn't live with him anymore. She filed in the spring. I didn't ask her to when I didn't have to. She still hasn't apologized for the dinner. I've made my peace with the fact that she probably never will, that some people can't say the words because saying them would mean carrying them, and she's carried enough. But she came to my house at Thanksgiving. She stood in my hallway for a long time looking at the barn, the ugly one, the one with the crooked weather vane and the thumb-smeared sky. And she said, she really couldn't paint, could she? And I laughed for real, for the first time in months. No, I said, she really couldn't. What she could do was see people. She saw me, all those afternoons in the sunroom, the only one who showed up. And somehow, with shaking hands and a rattling space heater, she saw all of this too, saw far enough ahead to leave me the one thing nobody would ever try to take, because nobody would ever guess it was worth taking. Promise me you won't let anybody tell you what it's worth. I keep that promise every morning in my hallway with my coffee, looking at a barn that's worth nothing and everything. The man who threw it in the ice runs a smaller dealership 2 states away now. No inflatable tube man. I drove past it once, on purpose, and then I drove home, and I didn't think about him again. For a long time I thought the cruelest part of that night was the ice water, the sound the canvas made going in. The way 40 people decided all at once that it was safer to laugh than to speak. But the longer I sit with it, the more I understand it wasn't the ice. It was how predictable it all was. A man who measures everything in dollars will always throw away the thing he can't price. Because to him a thing with no price tag has no reason to exist. He couldn't see the painting because he had never once in his life learned to see a person. That blindness wasn't bad luck. It was a debt he'd been building for years. And it came due the night he held that barn over his head and called it garbage. What saved me wasn't revenge, and I want to be honest about that, because revenge is a story people tell to feel powerful. What actually saved me was 3 quieter things, and I didn't have all of them at once. I had to grow into them. The first was simply doing the right thing when it cost me. Sitting in that sunroom all those afternoons when nobody else showed up, carrying a soaked painting 4 hours through the dark instead of leaving it in a tub of beer bottles. None of that paid off the way you'd write it in a movie. It paid off because it kept me the kind of person who could be trusted with what came next. The second was patience that looked like weakness from the outside. I didn't scream at the party. I didn't sell the painting the day I learned what it was. I let the people who underestimated me keep doing it, because their certainty that I was nothing was the only weapon I actually needed. I didn't have to lie. I just had to wait and look and read a public court filing that anybody could have read but nobody bothered to. And the third was the hardest. It was the willingness to keep standing after my own mother looked at the floor instead of at me, to drive home crying and then get up the next morning, to do the slow, unglamorous work of proof 4 months, 3 experts, a lab in New York, when it would have been so much easier to just stay angry and broke and write. My grandmother understood all of this before I did. With shaking hands and a rattling space heater, she didn't leave me money she knew would be stolen. She left me something a greedy man would throw away with his own hands. And she trusted me to be steady enough, clear-eyed enough, and good enough to recognize it when the time came. Promise me you won't let anybody tell you what it's worth, she said. I think now she wasn't talking about the painting at all.